This morning we are continuing our summer message series from 1 Thessalonians. It's called Another King, and we've been exploring how Paul is teaching the Thessalonians here that when we choose to follow Jesus, we're choosing an entirely new way of life. So we're going to actually wrap up this series next Sunday. I hope you'll be here for that. I know it's Labor Day weekend, but we've got a fun way we're going to kind of wrap it all up, and I think you'll enjoy it. But today we're going to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and we're going to talk about the day of the Lord, right? Which is, depending on how you grew up, like you hear that as the day of the Lord, dun, 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 or I don't know exactly where you come from. Maybe you didn't grow up in church at all, and so the day of the Lord is not a particularly meaningful thing to you at all. But basically, what we're looking at this morning is Paul, in the last few sections that we've looked at, he has shifted into a very practical, giving advice, telling them this is how you should live, kind of a live this way. And what he's telling us this morning is that this is how we live until the very end. Right, so we're following this thing through all the way to the end, and he starts to talk about the return of Christ. Now again, depending on your background, you might already kind of be going down memory lane, and you are thinking of times as a kid that you heard about Jesus was returning, and it was horrifying. Right? Or as a teenager or as an adult, maybe you sat in a service at some point and the pastor or the evangelist or the youth camp speaker, as soon as they said, today we're going to talk about the return of Jesus, what you heard was, I'm about to terrify you all and you're going to get saved at the end because Jesus is coming back and you're all horrible and maybe a couple will make it. Right? And so then they go into these long messages on, wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and natural disasters. And then there's serpents and there's dragons and there's an antichrist and there's a mark of the beast. And they go to Revelation and nobody understands Revelation, but they're going to tell you what it all means anyways. And suddenly the bees are helicopters and all of the, and you're completely lost. And all you're really kind of left with is, that sounds horrible. And so I better do everything I can to make sure I'm not here for that. Now, what I want to encourage you with, because I've had to reflect on my own experiences with kind of the way the day of the Lord has been presented to me, the return of Christ. And what I've realized in my own life, and I think would probably be true for most of us, is that most of the fears I had associated with that, they weren't the fault of my pastor or my youth pastor. They had far more to do with what was going on in my own heart. I don't know exactly the churches you grew up in, but I would feel pretty safe saying that for most of us, now, there's a rotten apple in every bunch. But for most of us, we grew up with pastors who wanted the best for us, who wanted to encourage us, and when they talked about these things, they were trying to put hope in our hearts. But sometimes, because we were insecure in our own relationship with the Lord, maybe we weren't walking with Him at all, we instead heard the coming of Christ as a threat that was being held out to try to get us to straighten up. And so what I really want to do for us this morning is see what Paul teaches us in 1 Thessalonians 5 about the end of all things and about how for us as followers of Jesus, the end of all things is a source of hope, a source of joy, and it's a reminder that at the return of Christ, we continue to live with Him forever. All right, so if you have a Bible, we're going to read from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. If you don't have one, it'll be here on the screens for you. Paul writes, "Now, brothers and sisters, about times and dates we do not need to write you. For you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly, as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that this day should not surprise you like a thief. You are children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness, so then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and the hope of salvation as a helmet. For God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with Him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are now doing." Now, before we get into the details of this passage, it's important for us to understand what the early church believed about the return of Jesus. Right? So if you were able to read through all of the Apostle Paul's letters in the New Testament, you would see kind of a recurring theme in this firm belief that Jesus will return. And if you go back and you read the Gospels, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, you would see that Jesus himself taught that he was going to return. That he had come, he would suffer, he would die, he would return to heaven, but the day would come when he would return and establish his kingdom fully and finally. And so for the early church, this was one of the first lessons they learned about who Jesus was and what it meant to follow him. They learned that they were sinners, that he had come to forgive them of their sins. They learned that he had suffered, died, and been resurrected. And they learned that he was going to return. And so what that means is they lived very much with the same experience you and I do. They lived in the Jesus has already come time. He has come, he has suffered, he has died, he has been resurrected, he has extended new life to us. And yet they also lived in the not yet time. He has not yet returned to restore and renew all things. And so they lived in this land in between, which is where you and I still find ourselves this morning. Where we look back and we're thankful that he has come, we are with him in the present, but we still look forward with this longing to the day that he will come back. So in this land of the already not yet is where we find ourselves, and it's where the Thessalonians found themselves. The early church longed for and expected the return of Christ in every season of life, both good and bad. And what that means for us today is that we too should live with that same expectancy. This idea that Christ could return at any moment. And for us, that's a source of hope. It is the anticipation of a long-awaited reunion. Right? It's not a fearful thing. It holds no terror for us, but it's something we look forward to and we long for. That is how the Thessalonians felt, and yet they also had some of these same fears that you and I have of, well, is there a chance that we're going to miss out on it? Is there a chance that he won't return? And so Paul is writing to address those questions. And as he writes to them, the very first question he addresses is, when will Jesus return? Right? Because if we believe, yes, he's coming back, then for all of us, the most natural next question is, when will he return? And Paul tells the Thessalonians, Jesus will come back on September 17th, 2029. Right? No, he doesn't. Like, you can read. Okay, some of you got real nervous there. Like, where are we going? Are you writing a book? No, I'm not. But here's the thing. Paul doesn't set a date. He does the opposite of date setting. He says, brothers and sisters, about times and dates we do not need to write to you. For you know very well the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Paul tells the Thessalonians, because this is in all of us. Right? I don't know if you've ever had this experience with your kids where you've told them something good is coming, right? Like, hey, we're going to go on a vacation, or we're going to buy this new thing, or we're going to get this present, or you're on a trip, right? And you're just driving to get there. And constantly they want to know, when? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? When are we moving? When are we going on the vacation? How much longer, right? It's why most of you, like my family, you've got some kind of Christmas countdown in your house. So you can tell your kids when December hits, like, when the snowman gets to 25, that's when it is. Stop asking me, right? And so there's just this natural thing in us. When we're hoping for something, we want it as soon as possible. And when it comes to the return of Christ, it's the same thing. But one thing Paul wants to make very, very clear to us is you are not going to know when it comes. It's going to surprise you. And so what that means for us is that any time someone tells us, I have determined the date Christ will return, they have removed themselves from the bounds of Orthodox Christianity and are standing out on an island by themselves, and we should pay them absolutely no attention. Jesus himself tells us in Mark chapter 13, he says, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. The only thing we know about the exact time of Christ's return is that we will never know the exact time of Christ's return. So we should avoid endless speculation about what this means, that Jesus is coming. We live with an ongoing expectancy that he could return at any moment. And as followers of Jesus, that gives us hope and peace. So very practically, what this means is that we don't have to get all worked up every time there's another war, every time there's a rumor of war, every time there's an election, every time there's a natural disaster, every time there's an eclipse, right? Like all of these things, you just calm down, right? Because here's the deal, like and obviously this would not be any of us, but I've heard that some Christians sometimes kind of freak out every time there's, a presidential election. And they kind of act like the return of Christ depends on who we elect right now. And some of them might send me emails. Again, not you, but some of them would. Stop! We don't know when he's coming. We do know that he's coming. So all that we really know is every day he doesn't come, we're one day closer to when he does. Yes, there will be wars and rumors and wars. Paul also says here, when people are crying out peace and safety, he will come. What's the whole point of the New Testament's teaching on the return of Jesus is it could happen at any moment. So live like it could happen at any moment. For us as Christians, though, it holds no terror, it holds no fear. We're not afraid of it. We don't have to try to manipulate it. You're not going to make Jesus come back a second earlier or a second later than God has ordained for him to return. Your job is to be faithful. My job is to be faithful, to anticipate his return and to live in light of it. So Paul begins from the earliest foundations of the church to build into our fabric this idea of you will never know the time. It's going to be a surprise. And because of that, we want to live in light of his return every single day. And so he begins to shift into this idea that what we believe about then changes the way we live now. He says in verse 4, "You, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so this day should not surprise you like a thief. You are children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night. Those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate and the hope of salvation as a helmet." Paul assures the Thessalonians, Jesus is coming. You're not going to know when, but for you who believe in him, it will not surprise you like a thief. Right? So what he means here is that the return of Christ is going to surprise us all. Right? He's already laid that out. Nobody knows when it's coming. He says, for those who don't know Christ, the day will come like a thief. This is an unwelcome surprise. For those who follow Jesus, he says it will be a surprise, but not like a thief. The day of Christ, the day of his return, for those who believe in him, is the best kind of surprise. Right? This is when you walk home and your spouse pulls in the driveway with the new car and says, "Look what I got you." This is the best kind of surprise where your parents call you and say, "Hey, you know that uncle that you didn't know too much? He died and he left you massive amounts of money." Right? This is you open the email and it says the thing that you hoped for, here you go, have fun with it. Right? This is the feeling of a parent when their child comes home. They're like, "Mom, Dad, you know how I don't have good grades? I won a drawing and got a full ride to college." Right? This is the absolute best kind of surprise. It's just like total freedom. It's a weight being lifted off. And what Paul tells us is, look, the day of the Lord for those who believe, it's going to surprise you, but not like a thief, because it's something you're longing for. It's something you're anticipating. It is the fulfillment of all of your hopes and your dreams. You are pushing towards it. And then he begins to push us towards this idea that if we believe that about the future, then it should change the way that we live today. Let us not be like the others, Paul writes, who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. And this is where we start to get into that idea of if you believe Jesus could return at any time, then you should live like Jesus would return at any time. And for a lot of us, this is where the discomfort comes, right? Now, if you've been around the church for a while, which even though I'm a young adult, I have, right? I'm going to claim that till February 11th of next year, and then I'll age out officially. But if you've been around, you have heard messages along these lines, right? Jesus is coming, and he's not coming into that movie house to get you. I don't know who says movie house, but apparently that's what it got called at some point, and Jesus didn't go there. Jesus is coming. Don't be dancing with some girl you're not married to. Jesus is coming. And if you cuss, he'll ignore you. Jesus is coming. Will he take you if you're talking about someone? Will he take you if you just lied? Will he take you if you just stole? Jesus is coming. And so sometimes this thought of Jesus is coming, so you need to live like he's coming right now so that you can go with him when he comes, it winds up producing this kind of paralyzing fear where you start to feel like I have to be absolutely perfect in every moment, because if I have the slightest unconfessed sin in my life, then Jesus is not going to take me with him when he comes. And it begins to create incredible insecurity. And it's why for some of you, there have been seasons of life where your last prayer every night before you go to bed is, God, forgive me of all the stuff I know I did, and forgive me of all the stuff that I didn't know that I did, because if you come in the middle of the night, I don't want to be left behind. It begins to create this insecurity. I thought of this yesterday. I was watching one of my kids play basketball out in Broken Arrow, and the game was going back and forth, and I was sitting up in the stands and sitting next to the coach who was coaching the next game. And in the middle of this game that's going on, the coach of the other team got a technical, and the guy next to me, he said, hey, what happened there? I said, oh, that coach hollered something at the ref, and the ref gave him a technical. And he looked at me, and he shook his head, and he goes, that coach is a pastor. He shouldn't be getting technicals. Now, again, I was in the stands next to the guy. I was not the one getting the technical. Okay, so, but I'm up there, but it reminded me of fears that I had as a child, because my understanding of the return of Christ meant for that pastor down there on the bench who just got a technical, if he didn't repent instantly and Jesus came back before the final buzzer, he's left on the bench because he shot his mouth off to a referee, right? And this is the anxiety and insecurity that for some of us is produced when we talk about the suddenness of Christ's return. He could come at any moment, so we need to live like he could come at any moment. But here's the thing. When Paul talks about the return of Jesus, he is not trying to create insecurity in the heart of the believer. Right? This is where we have to be faithful to read what he says in 1 Thessalonians 5 in light of what he has said in 1 Thessalonians 1, 2, 3, and 4. You go all the way back to 1 Thessalonians 1, and Paul starts his letter by reminding the Thessalonians, you are the sons and daughters of God. You have been chosen by him. He has given you a new identity, and your identity is secure in him, not because of who you are, but because of who Jesus is. Right? And his grace is enough for all your sins and all your misgivings and all your mistakes. And then he goes on in 1 Thessalonians 3, and he tells us that the Spirit inside of us will give us power to live the life that God has called. So this idea of Jesus could return at any time, so let's live like he could return at any time, is not a heavy religious burden being laid on you, but instead it is a freedom where the Spirit comes and says, look at the life you're going to live one day, and now my Spirit, my power will enable you to start to live that life on this day. Right? The return of Christ does not create insecurity in the heart of a believer. It creates hope. And if the return of Christ is creating insecurity in your heart this morning, it's a sign that you again can surrender to the Lord, ask him to bring that assurance of your salvation and to confirm what he has already done for you in your heart and in your experience. The day of the Lord brings hope, not terror. Right? Paul's not making us insecure. Instead, he's just pointing us towards this idea. What you believe about then affects how you live now. He says, be awake and sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, the hope of salvation as a helmet. To be awake is to live with an alertness for who Jesus is, for what he's going to do, and what he is doing right now. Right? Long before the idea of being woke ever appeared in the Urban Dictionary, the Apostle Paul was teaching us, live with an awareness. Live with an idea of what is going on around you. Live with an alertness for God's activity in the world. Don't be lulled to sleep by any delays in his coming, but live with the alertness that Christ could come at any moment. And he also tells us to be sober, to be self-controlled, right? To be clear-headed about what's happening and where that is leading us on God's path, to not become intoxicated with all of the distractions of our culture, but to see the world with clear eyes, to make wise decisions by the power of the Spirit living inside of us. And what he says is, as we live with awake and alert hearts, as we live with sober, self-controlled minds, we will not only anticipate the day of the Lord, but we will encourage each other that it is a very good thing. It says in verse 9, "For God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are now doing." The return of Christ. Now here's where it does get difficult, because maybe in past periods of the church, the return of Christ, there's been a heavy emphasis on the wrath of God being outpoured. Right? In current emphasis on the return of Christ, we've maybe swung to the other end of the spectrum to where it's primarily about the renewal and recreation of all things, and we don't really talk about the wrath of God being outpoured. But here's what Paul is painting for us, that when Jesus returns, he will fully and finally deal with evil. It will be erased. He will remake the heavens and the earth without any stain or taint or possibility of future evil. We will exist and rule and reign with him as he intended for us to do. And to do that, it means he has to deal with all of the effects of sin. So the day of the Lord is a day of wrath, right? It is the day that God's wrath is poured out on all of the effects of sin, on all who have willfully and joyfully rejected him. But for the believer, the day of wrath is the day of salvation. The day of God dealing with evil is the day that we are reminded again, he has already dealt with our evil in Christ. So we can encourage one another, because on that day when he returns, it reminds us of what Jesus has already done and what he is continuing to do in these moments. And it means for us, the day of the Lord is the day of salvation. And we will be safe and we will be secure in him. And Paul tells us, whether you are dead or alive, you will be with the Lord forever. He is returning. He is drawing you back. And so we don't put off the ideas of God's wrath, but at the same time, we don't need to overly focus on them, because the day of wrath is the day of salvation. And that's why it becomes a source of hope. That's why it becomes a source of encouragement, because the return of Christ highlights our perfect and final deliverance from his wrath. In Paul's letter to the 1 Corinthians, in chapter 11, he's writing to teach them about communion. And in doing so, he presents this idea that when we receive communion together, it reminds us of what Jesus has done, what he is doing, and what he will do. He says in chapter 11, verse 26, "Whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Communion helps us to look back and to remember. The day of salvation has occurred. Right? When Christ laid down his life for me, it was the perfect and final sacrifice for all of my sin. There is nothing left to be atoned for. There is only a gift to be received. And so we look back on communion this morning, remembering the sacrifice of Christ and its perfect satisfaction to restore us in our relationship with God. We also look at what's being done in this moment, that what Jesus did then He is still doing now. That was the day of salvation, and every day from there until now is also the day of salvation. That every day Christ has saved me, and He is continuing to save me. He has forgiven me, and He is continuing to forgive me. He has given me a new identity, and He is continually giving me a new identity. But then communion also looks to the future. That was the day of salvation. These are all the day of salvation, and one day on the day of the Lord, it will be the day of salvation. The perfect culmination of all things. The perfect end to all sin. The perfect restoration of our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. Paul says, when you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. Communion reminds us that what Jesus has done, Jesus will do. If we can trust Him to handle our past, and we can trust Him to secure our future, then we can trust Him with today. So in just a moment, we're going to receive communion together. And as you hold that bread and that cup in your hand, I want it to be a reminder to you that for everything you've done, Christ is forgiven. That for all the ways sin has distorted your identity, He is renewing and remaking you in His image. And I want it to also point your attention ahead to remember that this life is not all that there is. That there will be a day that He returns. That the ultimate goal of God's kingdom is not just this present world, but it is an eternity with Him in a new heavens and a new earth and resurrected bodies. It is this beautiful return to the Garden of Eden where we know God and we walk with Him and we live with one another with absolutely no shame. And as we receive communion together, we are receiving the hope of that promise. That what He has promised, He will do. And as we live in this land in between what Jesus has done and what He will do, we continually trust Him. Whatever your problems are this morning, the one who has defeated death and the one who will return and conquer all things is the King of your circumstances. It's the King of your heart, the King of your relationships, the King of your finances, the King of your mistakes. If He can do those two things, these are the anchors of our soul. Jesus has come and Jesus will come. And we live in this space in between where by the power of His Spirit, we receive the new life He has already brought, and we live in anticipation of the new life He is yet to bring. And in all these moments in between, we are constantly letting God make us alert and sober to understand our place in this big story He's writing, and to understand that our problems are minuscule compared to the plan He is working. So as you hold those elements in your hand as the ushers come to pass them, may they be a sign of hope to you this morning. That Christ has come, He is coming in your life, and He will come to restore and renew all things.